Hi there! Mika announced a few days ago that the next limited banner character after Diane will be Dushevnaya. She is a dedicated ice support the ice team has been missing, and for a good while she will be the last ice character to release. To help you determine if she's worth your investment, it's time for another pre-release review of her skill kit, along with her strengths and weaknesses. I'll be showcasing scene and gameplay footage from Artelya and Saya. Links to their respective videos will be in the description below. As usual, this video will provide a comprehensive overview of her gameplay and utility, and I'll cover the details about her build, including keys, fortifications and gear after her release. With that disclaimer out of the way, let's get started. Dushevnaya is a hybrid between an ice support and DPS character, who amplifies the team's damage while also having some reasonably heavy-hitting abilities herself. Due to this fusion of roles, she doesn't excel at either task, so if you were to evaluate one side in isolation, you'd come away unimpressed. The issue becomes even more apparent when looking at her fortifications, as they are split down the middle between upgrading either role to a satisfactory level. Nevertheless, her early release on the global side will benefit anyone who has invested in the ice team and will likely make it the meta team for the coming months. I'll be discussing her contribution to the team and the benefits of her upgrades as I explain her skill set further, but my main concern will be her performance at V0. Since most of you are likely interested in her role as an ice amplifier, let me begin by introducing that side of her kit. As shown here, Dushevnaya starts the battle with an attack buff that shares the same icon as Suomi's signature weapon ice damage buff. Like Macchiato, she also gains insight when her HP is above 80%, which increases the range of her attacks by 1 tile. Even though the attack buff is only displayed on herself, it applies to the whole team, buffing everyone's damage by 10% and further increasing ice damage by 10%. In that sense, her passive amplification is comparable to a V2R1 Suomi, as this effect is permanently active as long as she remains alive. Dushevnaya typically starts the battle by using her ultimate. It applies the buff Arctic Benediction to allies within a 7-tile range, which boosts the next attack's damage by 10% and applies frozen to targets before the attack. This prior application of the debuff is relevant for phase strike wielders, but more importantly it's very useful for Macchiato, who benefits from a passive 20% damage increase against targets with frozen. At V1, her ultimate receives an upgrade that makes it apply a powerful random buff to allies in range for 2 turns. This random buff can be a useful attack, crit or damage increase, but it may also be a useless defensive buff. With this upgrade, it also gives a 2-tile extra movement buff to everyone for 2 turns. Here you see the Arctic Benediction buff, which applies to everyone in range and affects the next attack. Below it, you see a secondary effect to her ult, called Glacial Domain, which affects only Dushevnaya. Glacial Domain lasts for 2 turns and gives her action support twice per turn. She also gains 2 extra confectance points at the start of her turn. Note that she passively regenerates 2 confectance points every turn, so by using her ult, she instantly replenishes her confectance index. Here you can see the visual effect of her Arctic Benediction buff, which gives everyone an icy glow with snowflakes circling around. This visual indicator is a reminder that your next attack should make good use of this buff. Now Loda uses her ultimate on these enemies with Arctic Benediction. As demonstrated here, the frozen debuff applies to the targets before the damage is dealt. Also note that the right target was afflicted with Avalanche from Suomi, so with this frozen application, Avalanche reached its 5th stack and triggered its stability reducing effect. The frozen debuff is applied with the attack of the character who carries the buff, so when a character like Suomi does her preemptive support action, the debuff is applied afterward. Here you see a comparison between Macchiato's S1 with and without the Arctic Benediction buff, which leads to about a 20% damage difference. Note that even in the no buff condition, the enemy is afflicted with frozen, so the extra damage from Macchiato's passive is activated either way, even though the application of frozen is more difficult without Arctic Benediction. After seeing all this, you may be thinking that her amplification is not so bad after all. Indeed, the buff from the ultimate in unison with her passive buff is decent enough. However, the ultimate suffers from a 3-turn cooldown, so after everyone uses their buffed attack on turn 1, you have to wait until turn 4 to activate the Arctic Benediction effect again. With her V5 upgrade, the ultimate gives 2 stacks of Arctic Benediction, meaning it applies to the next 2 attacks, but that still leaves you with 2 turns of downtime. Before we move on, let's also briefly look at the aforementioned support actions she gains from her self-buff Glacial Domain. They deal 80% of her attack as physical damage and go after the initiating attack. As demonstrated here, Diane uses her ultimate, which is preceded by Suomi's assist, and then Diane does her damage, and then Dushevnaya concludes the attack with her assist. Normally, you'd expect your support to go before the DPS in order to reduce the target's stability or apply buffs to the ally, but this just goes to show that Dushevnaya was partly designed as a sub-DPS herself. With that said, due to its unimpressive damage and no additional effects, it's essentially just another basic attack added into the mix. To make matters worse, when Glacial Domain runs out, she won't assist for 2 full turns until her ultimate is up again. Moving on to her second skill, which leans more towards her role as a support character. The skill costs 3 confectance points and deals 50% of her attack as ice damage in a 2-tile range around its target tile. Importantly, it creates frost tiles in its area of impact. Note that because Dushevnaya hasn't attacked yet, she applies Frozen with this attack to all targets due to the Arctic Benediction buff from her ultimate. When she executes the skill at full convectance points, she gets to perform the skill a second time with an enhanced version. Note that this is not like extra command where you freely choose among the available abilities. Instead, you can only use her as 2 or end her turn. For the second execution of the skill, its damage is enhanced, and it now applies Frozen for 1 turn to the hit targets. The double execution of her S2 depletes her convectance index completely. In a typical rotation where she would use the skill on the second turn with Glacial Domain active, it would take her only 1 turn of downtime to fully restore her index. With this, you're no longer reliant on Suomi's ultimate to implant ice weakness to targets. Her fourth fixed key, Courageous Claymore, adds an important utility to the skill. When her S2 breaks a target's stability, it applies a 30% defense reduction debuff for 2 turns. While this effect only applies when Dushevnaya is the one to break the target, it's still a powerful effect that also frees Jeongju from the team's lineup when you wish to run the burn team in parallel in double team mode. On a side note, besides all the utility, this double S2 execution deals some decent AoE damage and can help clear enemies in mobbing stages. Having said that, let's continue with her first skill, which heavily leans into her role as a sub DPS, making it likely the least interesting aspect of her kit. Going back to the first turn when Lauda used her ultimate to kill 2 enemies, Dushevnaya's first skill builds up stacks of a buff called Ice's Grace, whenever an enemy with freeze debuffs dies. At the very edge of the screen we can see her gaining the stacks, 1 per debuffed and defeated enemy. The stacks by themselves don't do anything interesting, but they upgrade her as 1 once they reach a stack count of 4. First, let's look at the base version of the skill. It deals single target physical damage for 110% of her attack. That's it. It's a slightly better version of a basic attack and is best avoided without 4 stacks of Ice's Grace. With 4 stacks though, you get an enhanced version of the skill, which deals ice damage for 130% of attack, or 150% if the target stands on a frost tile. It also makes you ignore 50% of cover damage reduction. As shown here, the normal 30% reduction is now only displayed as 15%. Once used, the Ice's Grace stacks are reset and you need to build up 4 stacks once more. In terms of output, the enhanced skill does manage to deal damage more akin to a DPS character. In this comparison between Dushevnaya's first skill and Diane's first skill, you can see that her damage is quite comparable. Moreover, Dushevnaya received the previously shown defense buff up from her V1 ultimate, whereas Diane carries a 20% damage increase from the same ultimate. All that is to say, with the right setup, she will deal more damage than your average supporter and contribute in that way to the total output of your team. One glaring issue with the acquisition of Ice's Grace stacks is the condition to defeat enemies. While this is manageable in mobbing stages where you have the opportunity to defeat multiple enemies per turn, it's near impossible to gather 4 stacks on a boss fight. The only way to generate any stacks in fights where there's a single enemy is Dushevnaya's third fixed key Magical Support. It adds an effect to her S2 which allows for a quote-unquote reaction between frost tiles, such that if an existing frost tile gets overwritten by a new one, they are instead removed, cleanse its buff from the target standing on that tile, and give Dushevnaya 1 stack of Ice's Grace. As shown here, she first uses her S2 to generate a frost tile underneath the boss, and on the second use triggers the tile reaction before the damage is dealt, gaining 1 stack. Afterwards, you see that the frost tile directly underneath the boss disappears. I'd like to use this clip to also demonstrate that the tile the enemy stands on is different from its hitbox. While from this perspective you might assume that all the frost tiles inside the hitbox would react and generate stacks, in truth, only the tile in the center counts. Since removing the frost tiles underneath the boss is generally against your best interests, you can combine Dushevnaya's double S2 with the prior ultimate from Suomi. As shown here, the boss is standing on such a frost tile from Suomi, and now Dushevnaya's S2 triggers a reaction with the existing tile, removing it as a result. Since she gets to use the skill again, she can now reapply the frost tile underneath the boss. Nevertheless, the process is painstakingly slow, and since even a large enemy only occupies a single tile, Dushevnaya can only generate 1 Ice's Grace stack every time she goes through this whole spiel. Case in point, in Seiya's example of the 7-turn guild boss fight, it took him all 7 turns to build up 4 measly stacks. Here you see the final attacks from Dushevnaya, Mosin Nagant and Macchiato lined up side by side. As you can tell from these numbers, at the end of it all, you get rewarded with average damage for a single use of the skill. While some of her upgrades improve the damage or the speed of stacking, it really doesn't help the fact that her S1 is completely detached from her support role. In principle, the idea of a supporter that functions as a sub-DPS is completely legitimate. However, in Dushevnaya's case, her numbers seem just too undertuned to be competitive. Even at V6, her DPS is still not worth the investment, though her lacking amplification gets solved by massively increasing her passive buffing, making her a top tier support simply for existing. Continuing with the typical gameplay rotation, you will pretty much always want to start the battle with her ultimate. The earlier you get the cooldown going, the better. Just ensure you line up your heavy hitting abilities from the DPS with the Arctic Benediction buff. Since the ultimate and her passive fully restore her Confectance Index, you'll want to use the double S2 next. This generates frost tiles underneath the enemy to implant ice weakness, and if you have the corresponding key equipped and time the stability break with your S2, you can also apply defense reduction to the enemy. Of course, when you're running the team with Chungju, you don't have to worry about this. Since you still have your Glacial Domain on this turn, you will generate 4 Confectance points at the end of it. On the next turn you're forced to use her S1, whether you're stacked up or not, because we're not fully maxed on Confectance points, and thus can't access a double S2. Now that the Glacial Domain buff has run out, you also no longer have access to support attacks. On the 4th turn, it's time to double S2 again. If you have the fixed key equipped, which causes a tile reaction, remember to chain this after Suomi's ultimate so that you can first remove the tile and then reapply it. Then on turn 5, it's finally time to use her ultimate again. Make sure your Macchiato has enough Confectance points to use her S1 alongside the Arctic Benediction buff, otherwise you're wasting what little amplification you can squeeze out of the Chuni Sniper. From here on out, the rotation repeats itself. Since her ultimate restores additional Confectance points, you get to use her double S2 again on the next turn. Keep in mind that the tile reaction can also be used to cleanse buffs from the enemy, otherwise all the aforementioned disclaimers apply. Finally, you're back at the point of the rotation where you have to use the S1. At this point though, hopefully with 4 stacks of Isis Grace. I think with that you get the gist of it. Moving on, we also have to address her very recent mod key, which conceptually is the developer's way to buff older units. Since her key was released in the most recent Chihuahua patch, and because the Ice team is quite unpopular in CN, I can't showcase any current gameplay. I will make a small follow-up video once I can find some, but for now I'll just go over the changes like this. The buff addressed both of her roles and tried to significantly improve her performance at V0. First, her passive amplification gets better as she now buffs the 2 allies with the highest attack on the team, excluding herself, for an additional 10% damage and 10% ice damage boost, making it a permanent 20% general damage and ice damage boost each. Next, her stack generation of Isis Grace becomes much easier, as she now gains a stack whenever an ally deals ice damage. Moreover, the stacks are now tied to her role as a supporter, as each stack increases the team's ice damage by 5% up to 15%. Finally, they did not give up on her role as a sub-DPS. Now her single target attacks will deal ice damage, ignore 30% of the enemy's defense, and her own ice damage gets amplified by 30%. I'm not sure if this applies to her support actions as well, but it does sound that way from the description. And with that, I believe we've covered all you need to know about Dushevnaya's skill kit to evaluate her value for your account. In summary, Dushevnaya is a dedicated ice support masquerading as a sub-DPS. She contributes a decent 20% damage amplification for the ice team just for being on the field. While her ultimate buff, Arctic Benediction, further adds to the team's output, it only applies to a single attack and suffers from a 3-turn downtime. At V1, the damage boost is increased by 10% and she additionally gives a random powerful buff for 2 turns, but the randomness and long ultimate cooldown make it still not worth the investment. Besides these direct methods to buff the ice team's output, she also has ample access to frost tile generation. These can implant ice weakness and inflict enemies with frozen debuff, which is particularly relevant for Macchiato's passive and damage buff. With the corresponding fixed keys equipped, she gains some additional utility. On the one hand, her 4th key can apply a 30% defense reduction when she causes the enemy to enter stability break with her S2. While this may be difficult to time against bosses, it does make the team less reliant on Chungju. On the other hand, her 3rd key can be used to cleanse the enemy of buffs when she causes a frost tile reaction, something she can easily do, particularly in unison with Suomi. Having said that, most of her amplification and utility is tailored to the ice team. With the current state of the global server, this makes her the most specialized limited character to date. If you've invested in the ice team and like its playstyle, this may not be an issue for you, but unlike Suomi or Dayan, she really doesn't see any play anywhere else. The biggest downfall of her kit is the lackluster DPS side. Her Isis Grace doesn't synergize with her support role, and it takes forever to stack up on boss fights. Even when fully stacked, her S1 damage is at best average and really not worth all the effort. Not to mention her pitiful action support, which only adds another basic attack after a DPS, while also suffering from a 2-turn downtime. Some of these issues are alleviated by her recent mod key. While I doubt this alone will help the ice team with its poor standing on CN, she at least justifies having a place on the team. Given that her own output has been significantly improved, perhaps her hybrid role will work out better now. With that, we've come to the end of this video. I hope my review has helped you better understand Dushevnaya's kit and enables you to make an informed decision on whether she's worth your pulse. If you're looking for a recommendation from me, it's pretty simple really. If you like the ice team and have invested in its characters, by all means go for it. At V0, she will contribute enough to the team to make it a top global meta choice for the coming months. If you're aware and are considering going all the way, her V6 is definitely a massive upgrade and makes her a top tier support. Don't be too concerned with the current state of the CN meta. As we've seen with the Springfield patch, things can change quickly with the release of a new character. The ice team hasn't seen any additions to their roster for over half a year, so it's no surprise the element has fallen out of favor. On the other hand, I believe it should be pretty obvious that Dushevnaya adds nothing to your account if you haven't or are not going to dedicate your resources to the ice team. Having said that, let me know in the comments below which way you lean. In any case, thank you so much for watching, see you next time.